Hello everyone. In this final video of the prehistoric series, I'd like to take you to the Neolithic Western Asia and wrap up our prehistoric episode with this lecture. There are notable continuities between the Upper Paleolithic lifestyles, the hunter-gatherer communities of the Upper Paleolithic in Europe and elsewhere, to the New Stone Age, to the Neolithic and the lifestyle of agriculturalists in the Neolithic. The continuity is because actually this kind of transition from hunting-gathering to settled agriculture-based life actually takes place over thousands of years. It doesn't happen overnight. We will talk about in this lecture, we will talk about the site of Göbekli Tepe in southeastern Turkey, in that red blob that you can see. And we will also talk about Çatalhöyük, which is in south central Turkey. You can see on the top left in your map. One of the earliest sites in this transition that I was talking about from the Upper Paleolithic to the Neolithic, with the warming of the climate, of course, the rising temperatures, the rising waters of the Mediterranean, right, is that it's one of the earliest sites that we actually see building activity is the famous site of Göbekli Tepe in southeastern Turkey, in the modern province of Urfa. Göbekli Tepe, as you see a general landscape of the site and the excavation house, you can see it, is a mountaintop sanctuary, a gathering and feasting place for hunter-gatherer groups from around in the region, where they built a series of circular monuments at the site of this limestone quarry, and you can see the kind of really the spread of limestone at the site. And this was inhabited between 9600 to 7300 BCE, as long as about 2,300 years. The discovery and excavation of the site in the recent decades created such an excitement and of global media attention that it is called things like the world's first temple, the site for the birth of religion, the Garden of Eden, and so on. It's kind of really endless. But what we know is that this is a kind of a really prelude to the beginning of the Neolithic. We call this Prepottery Neolithic because we don't have sort of pottery yet. We don't have evidence for domestication of plants and animals yet. But what we have is like a mountain sanctuary where hunting-gatherer groups are coming together, perhaps seasonally, perhaps year-round. What really shocked archaeologists around the world about the site is its monumental architecture in the construction of these monumental structures, which were semi-subterranean and surrounded by concentric stone walls that you can see here, a plan on the left and a perspectival reconstruction on the right. And we see a kind of an upper structure that is held by T-shaped monolithic pillars. And these circular spaces had benches around them and were used for feasting events. And this we know because all of these buildings that were excavated by archaeologists were packed full of animal bones with cut marks on them. They're butchering animals, eating them in a kind of a communal setting. Art historians were particularly excited about these monolithic pillars, these T-shaped pillars, since they were elaborately carved with visual representations in low relief. You see some examples here. The overall pillars are clearly conceived as human bodies, given the way that they arms and hands wrap around them. And they have belts, like decorated belts carved around their waists. Furthermore, many of the pillars also have these dangerous and ferocious animals that are carved in the form of low reliefs on their surfaces, back and front. And such as this one on the left with a roaring lion, and on the right we have a scorpion, a whole series of birds, and some geometric shapes that we have difficulty understanding at the moment. The bone evidence from these buildings suggests that they were these communities were hunting gazelles, aurochs, the extinct wild ox, boar, wild goat, onager, red deer, and fox. They're hunting, but these animals are not really the animals that they eat and the animals that they represent. They don't really overlap very much. We do see some foxes, but the other animals are not so much represented. But the animals that are represented here are more kind of really snakes and scorpions and lions and birds as well. So each building had about a lifespan of about 150 years, after which the building was buried, and a new building was built adjacent to it. When it comes to the representation of humans, which is a very rare occasion at this site, we find representation of both males and females, such as this small statuette on the right of a male figure with an erect penis. And this incised representation of a naked woman, perhaps better characterized as a graffiti, because it's clearly not part of the original kind of more sophisticated carving program, but it's sort of incised at a later date. And the woman is depicted in a kind of a crouched frontal position with something coming out of her vagina, perhaps giving birth, as some has interpreted. Miracle and Boric write in their article on Göbekli Tepe that if at Göbekli Tepe an anthropomorphic understanding of these stelae are accepted, that we understand that these stelae are actually human bodies. Carvings of animals are then put in, inscribed on and in the human bodies. And this juxtaposition is really interesting, and that it is yet another body of evidence for the animal-human hybridity proposal that I have put forward, or what David Van Gro calls fictive anatomies. And finally, turning to the site of Çatalhöyük, we will look at a large settlement of agriculturalists who already domesticated wheat and barley, as well as lentils and sheep and goat as well. It's a very, very large village composed of a relatively egalitarian society where each family lived in houses of similar size and construction. The houses were entered from top and organized in terms of small square platforms that you see here on the left, which were associated with different functions within the house, either cooking or sleeping, eating, some ceremonial functions. Under some of these platforms, members of the household who died are buried. There are burials under some of these platforms. if there's food processing on them, and etc. So many of the houses featured ritual paraphernalia, such as these decorated, these platforms that decorated with bucrania or plastered bull skulls, and their horns. The walls were covered with geometric or figurative wall paintings, and you also sometimes find sort of animal parts like leopard teeth or something like that, that's kind of really driven and put into the walls as well. The presence of animal representations, whether they're in these hunt scenes on the walls or on wall paintings, or more indexically present with their horns or teeth, etc., is very important. So the house space is in a way animated with the presence of these animals, potent and dangerous animals. Another important aspect of the Neolithic settlement life is the clay and stone figurines that are found at the site in abundance, pretty much in all houses, in their grain bins, in their trash pit heaps, and so on. These included hundreds and hundreds of tiny animal figurines, like the ones that you see on top left, or this kind of a splayed bear stamp seal on the bottom right, or we have a good collection of animal figurines, as you see on the top right, on top bottom left, especially the voluptuous female figurines. And I want to point out the woman on top right, the female figurine, which actually has a detachable head, which is really quite interesting. The archaeologists didn't find the head, but clearly it was that was the function of the figurine, is to have a detachable head. And this clay figurine is famous now at the Ankara Anatolian Civilizations Museum, excavated by James Mallard in a grain bin. This is a nude female figure seated on a throne and flanked by lions, displaying features of this kind of bodily ideal that we discussed in the earlier two lectures. So most likely associated with accumulated knowledge, wisdom, and a kind of a really prominence within the society. If you recall, in the first video, I started my discussion with figurines with this newly discovered example from Chateau. It was discovered in 2016, and it had a big splash. This is a relatively large figurine. It's about 7 inches tall and yay high, and finely carved and polished from marble, kind of a crystallized limestone, and it was carefully buried in fine, clean sand under the floor of a platform, and there was a tiny little sort of obsidian blade that was accompanying her. This nude woman has some distinctly carved facial features, as well as some shocking bodily representation of a sagging belly. This is something that we didn't really see very much in earlier figurines. Pendulous breasts that she's holding, and pronounced buttocks. In the absence of feet, it's clear that she's not meant to stand, but held in your hand, most likely. And from these examples, the scholars have pointed out some fascinating possibilities in interpreting prehistoric figurines in comparison to modern dolls. And this is something that I had proposed in the first video lecture, if you recall. The first is the idea of a human miniature. Why do people make miniature human beings, or miniature animals, or miniature houses, right? These miniature worlds, as I would like to call them, act as portals to alternative worlds. What does this mean? It's think of Alice in Wonderland. You become small and you enter an alternative, and a world that you weren't aware of. In which this kind of the scale change it creates new social hierarchies, and the miniature effect really allows you to enter this kind of really ontologically different and world with a very different politics. The second is about that politics and the idea that figurines are political. Figurines are not straightforward representations, and all representations are political. So figurines are not just reflections of a society, but they are they are produced to accomplish certain things in ritual contexts. And from many cultural contexts, we actually have evidence that these figurines, small individuals, miniature humans, are created to accomplish a particular effect in the society. So we could actually think about them as discourses, as politics. And third, when we think of the concept of performance and play, the element of performance that we find in the play, you recall we were talking about how when a child plays with a doll, the only possibility for the play to be possible to work is to assume that the doll is a real person. If you don't assume that the doll is a real person, a real actor within the play, then the play cannot happen. It's impossible to move forward. So there is this kind of really performative aspect of figurines and dolls in which these figurines are understood as real actors with imagined personhoods, similar to the fictive anatomies that we talked about by the idea proposed by David Van Gogh. And finally, I want to argue that figurines present a kind of a positive bodily ideal as fictive anatomies, and that's why their nudity is not a simple sort of nakedness and a sign of weakness, but their nakedness is a form of potency, a form of power, a form of accumulated wisdom, something that is very positive that is associated with these individuals, whether they are from the Upper Paleolithic, like the Willendorf figurine on the left, or the chateau figurines on the right. And so gendering in their bodies then takes place with also the inclusion and exclusion of certain bodily features, as we have seen. So these four ideas kind of really help me to think about this question of what are prehistoric figurines for, and what does their nudity, their nakedness represent? How does that work? And so I don't have a single answer in terms of, if you ask the question, sort of what is the function of these figurines, that's something that we will never really be able to tell, and there's probably such a variety of functions associated with these figurines. But that's not really important. The important thing, I feel, are to understand these terms in which that these figurines belong to miniature worlds as alternative worlds. They're political, they perform, they are real actors, and they present a particular kind of bodily ideal, and that's why that's their representational project as well. So I hope that all makes sense, and that is the end of the prehistoric section of my lectures. Thank you.